Right or die. And so um, I can see where you're coming from. I did see him interrupting a lot. And look, he's committed, like you are to the Bible. He's committed to a Quran-centric view. So when he says there's no contradictions, there's no errors, he's committed to ensuring that that's the case. Doesn't matter what you bring him, he's gonna find a way around it. I could bring him the inheritance error, which I think is a knockdown error against Islam. They're just gonna shrug their shoulders or try and find some way around it. I think
I
it's the
don't know that I've
best
heard of
error
that
there
one.
is. Say again?
When you're done, if you don't, I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't think I've heard of that one. Just when you're done giving your thoughts, if you could run that error, I would love to hear it.
Yeah. So I think, and Venus was telling me this, and I used to do it quite a bit, and I've just kind of stopped doing it now. That they're just going to do it from a Quran-centric point of view. So it doesn't matter what you bring them; they're going to find some other interpretation that they find compatible with the Quran. So be it prophecies, be it whatever, right? When you critique it, they're just going to take a different view. But the inheritance error in the Quran is basically the idea that in Surah 4:11, 4:12, and 4:176, it tells you how to split up somebody's inheritance when they die. And under certain rare circumstances, the Quran oversubscribes. In other words, when certain family members die, when you have a person who owns the property or whatever the case is, and that person dies, um, following the Quran, it will oversubscribe. In one case, you'll have to give away 112.5%. And in the other case, I can't remember off the top of my head the percentage. Now, this error didn't come up in Muhammad's time, but what happened historically, and this is from Muslim sources, is that people came to Umar al-Khattab and said, "Hang on, we're trying to follow what the Quran says, but we can't give this away. This is more than what the Quran is telling us to give away more than what we have." And so he consulted his scholars, and Ali disagreed, but they basically invoked something called awal, which is the idea that you reduce the portion sizes so that it equals to one. In other words, not over 100%. So they just reduce each portion size proportionately, but that of course contradicts the Quran. And of course, as you know, James, and I do, that you can't. If there's a conflict with the Quran, then you go with the Quran over anything else. So and the reason this is so good is because it's immune to all of the normal Muslim critiques, which is, hey, its interpretation, you've got to understand in Arabic, da da da. All of those sort of things that you heard from this Bobby guy doesn't work with the inheritance error. And so what you do is you get them to do the numbers, show them the numbers, and when it gets down to the fact that the scholars and the Quran conflict, there's just one question to ask, and it'll be surprisingly the non-answer that you get. And I've done this multiple times with people, and I just ask them, what number do we take? Do we take, Umar al-Khattab or the scholar's number or the Quran? Because the two numbers differ, but you've got to get them to write it down or to make it clear that the two numbers are different. Just
They,
ask them, which
they
one do you take?
I'm pretty sure they would just say the Quran. They always put the Quran first. So if
The
there is
problem
a
is the Quran, it shows an error there. And so the way they typically get around this, at least for Sunnis, and Shias do it in the same way, but just, appealing to Ali instead of Umar al-Khattab, is that they reduce the portion sizes. It's like an Islamic term called awal, which is just reducing each a little bit so that it equals one, and you can actually do that. But that correction is obviously, which basically tells you that the Quran has got an error. But again, the way these guys do it is they'll say, well, it's not a correction, it's an interpretation. Now, with the numbers, you see, this is why it's so good because you can't interpret numbers. Numbers either add up or they don't. It's not like you can have a different interpretation. One plus one is always going to be two in every language all over the world. It's universal. And so that's why this is so powerful. I'd have to run it. I'd have to show you, and somebody would have to go through it. The problem is in Clubhouse, you can't like show it visually because It's much more helpful if I show it visually. I can give the surahs and I can walk you through the process. But if it's done visually, it's just you pick it up very quickly. So that's
But
in a
what
If
are the
you
surahs?
nutshell.
I'm quite
It's,
curious.
can I ask Matt a question real quick? It's a Bible question when you guys get a chance.
as soon as we're done with this chunk with Rob, because I'm very interested in this. I think it's very interesting because you would be right. Like if the Quran is from Allah, and He's dividing up the inheritance, and the math does not work out where everything is split proportionately, that would be like a direct error. Like I don't know any way around that, especially when you say the Quran is infallible.
Yeah.
Uh,
So what
J
I
Wait, so just James, quickly, just to say, if you end up do using this use this argument against Hamza if you end up ever speaking to him, just in case.
Well, I'm not ready to run it by any means, but Rob just introduced
I'll
us,
do
and
it
I
with
would like
anybody
him
if you
to.
like. Anybody.
Yeah, I would love
I've
for
heard
Rob to
I've heard
like.
Rob run it before, and it they didn't have really good responses to it. But I am interested, Rob, in what specific chapter of this of the Quran that's in, just so I can look into it myself.
If
Yeah.
you want to tell us if you want to start running it, Rob, I can look for like a link to like a Quran if people want to follow, and that way they can hear it ran once, and then even if they can't follow along completely, at least then people would have the idea.
Yeah, I know the surahs out. Well, I know the surah numbers. I don't remember the exact reading it off. I can tell you out of my head the exact thing. I just won't be able to remember the verses off the top of my head. But it starts in Surah 4, Ayah 11. So Surah 4, verse 11. And that's where the inheritance sort of for, this sort of thing starts. And then it goes directly to the next verse, which is Ayah 12, verse 12. And then the other one jumps to number 176. This is all in chapter 4, so 11, 12, and 176. And essentially, if you read the verses, if a man dies, so the husband dies, um, so you've got to read the verses because you've literally got to go read this and then you follow what I'm saying. You can go and pick it up because it's not like it doesn't just jump out at you immediately. You've got to read the verses and follow along, and then you can do the sums. In fact, if you go online and you go and Google Islamic calculator, one of the first ones that comes up, you can go put the numbers in. When I tell you what the numbers are, and it'll actually tell you in the Islamic calculator that you've got to make this maths change. So they acknowledge it's a maths change. They just don't acknowledge that it's an error, right? And that's the
I
duplicity
put
because it's clearly an error.
Surah 4, 11 through 14 up at the top, Rob.
Yeah. So if you read 11 and 12, basically when a man dies and he leaves behind two or more daughters. So we just say three daughters. He leaves behind a wife and a father and a mother. Now, if you go read Surah 11 and 12, and you make sure that you write down, a husband dies, three daughters, a husband, sorry, a mother, a father, and a wife. If you go and read that and you add up what the Quran tells you, it'll add up to 9/8 in fractions or 111.5%. That one I know out of my head because I've done it so often. The other one is in 176, and that's when, if I remember correctly, that's when the woman dies and she leaves a husband and two sisters, and that also adds up to more than 100%. But I'm much more familiar with the first one I've given you. So you've got to
And
read the
that's
two surahs.
chapter
Mhm.
4, 176.
That's for, if I remember correctly, where the wife dies and leaves a husband and two sisters. But the one I've given you is where the husband dies and he leaves wife, three daughters, just to make it easy, father and mother.
All right, I'm just trying to find it so I can put it up top. So if anybody would like to go.
Now, they do have responses to this, by the way, but all of them will fail. But again, I ask a couple of pre-framing questions. I ask them, is the Quran inerrant? It contains no errors. Do you adhere to bid'ah, the idea that the Quran cannot be changed? And do you accept, especially if you're a Sunni, that if the early caliphs made a ruling, then that's something you have to adhere to? Because what people also want to do, James, is they want to appeal to different ways to try and get around this today, be it appealing to Muhammad Hijab or some other scholar today. But this already came up way back when, right? And if they are going to follow their, secondary and tertiary sources and history, then they'd have to go with what the early caliph decided on this. Who's got more authority than Umar al-Khattab, right? And so that's another question to ask so that we don't have to deal with any other variations, because they've tried all kinds of things with me. But none of them work here. Like I say, it's not about interpretation here. One guy tried an interpretation, but he was a Quranist, and I showed him even by his lights the word that he wanted to interpret. In fact, works as both a singular and a plural because he wanted to say, "Oh, it only appeals to one daughter." But then I went to look at the Arabic word, and in fact, it appeals to either one or more daughters. So that didn't work either.
I go hard in the paint, yeah, homie, I'm a saint. Ride or die.